Hi, my name is Connie, and welcome to YouTube Land and a story involving the Friends of Freddie and Freddie the Pig, the Paramount Pig of a series of children's books written by Walter R. Brooks between 1927 and 1958. Brooks is also famous for writing a set of short stories about a talking horse named Ed, which later on became a famous TV series in the 1960s. But I'm here to talk about Brooks and the Bean Farm, and Freddie the Pig, and how Brooks bugged us in his 26 books about Freddie the Pig and his friends. Now, much of the time we don't really notice the bugs in our midst. We walk along country paths and city sidewalks, paying no attention to the ants that scurry across or the caterpillars munching away on the leaves of a nearby bush or tree. And so it is in the Freddie series. Bugs appear in 21 of the 25 titles, at least according to Peter Tomas's fabulous and highly useful concordance, which you will find on our friendsoffreddie.com website. So, from Freddie Goes to Florida, published in 1927, to Freddie and the Dragon, published in 1958, Walter finds a spot in the action for some bug who might be a villain, a hero, or simply a handy device to move the plot forward. Mostly the bugs are just cameos, with many unnamed, so many readers might barely notice them. But they often perform useful tasks. For example, here we see some fireflies trying to get Charles the Rooster to stop talking. Brooks invented a dazzling array of characters in the 25 books that chronicled our pig's adventures. Most were either human or mammalian, plus a few avian, even a few reptilian. But there were also lots and lots of bugs who played at least a minor starring role, the most prominent being our spider friends, the Webbs, who I think grace every book in the series. But with a few exceptions, I'm going to focus on characters drawn from the smaller scientific order of insects, because if I brought the Webbs into it, I'd barely have time for any other critter in the bug universe. Having said that, the Webbs repeatedly come into a discussion of insects in the Freddie series, simply because the Webbs knew a lot of these insects, and their interaction with ants and flies is in fact how we met them. So I'll begin at the beginning. In Freddie Goes to Florida, the animals are heading south, spending the night in an abandoned house, where a sparrow shares the news that gold is buried in the house or nearby. While on an early morning stroll, Mr. Webb introduces himself to an ant. Snippets of their conversation are both charming and humorous. "Good morning," says Mr. Webb. "I am a stranger in these parts. I wonder if you can tell me if there is any good fly catching in the vicinity." While most ants would have ignored his question and returned to their work, this particular ant was flattered that Mr. Webb, a fine-looking spider, had spoken to her. So she led him to their anthill, which he admired politely. But then she told him of another, abandoned anthill, which, from her description, contained gold. So between Mr. Webb and the ant, the plot is laid for the animals to return from Florida with a sack of gold, which rescued the financially struggling bean farm. Long live ants! And by the way, Brooks may have known something about ants here because he described the workers as female, which happens to be true. Mr. Webb saved the day again on the return trip from Florida, when Charles and Henrietta were captured by the evil Mr. Winch, the man with the black mustache, and his son, the dirty-faced boy. This happened when the miscreants stole the phaeton containing that precious sack of gold. How to reclaim the gold and save his two feathered friends. Mr. Webb found a way, and he got cooperation from an insect that would normally be his lunch, a fly. In fact, originally Mr. Webb had planned to have this fly for breakfast. But then the fly cried out piteously, "Oh, Mr. Spider, good, kind Mr. Spider, please let me go. Please don't eat me. If you won't eat me, I'll do anything you want me to." Apparently Mr. Webb's kind heart caused him to pause, and his fine brain helped him cook up a scheme to recapture the gold, while also saving Henrietta and Charles. Luckily, the fly had quite the extended family, who all pitched in to carry out Mr. Webb's scheme of harassing Mr. Winch and his dirty-faced boy until they could walk off with the gold again. So all the flies attacked them, quote, young flies and stout middle-aged flies and old grandfather flies with no teeth and old grandmother flies with rheumatism in their wings. And all was well when the animals finally returned from Florida with the gold. Ants reappear in Freddy Goes to the North Pole, but they aren't the friendly ants Mr. Webb encountered going to Florida. Once again, Charles needed rescuing, along with the dog Jack, this time from wolves. Things could have gotten off to a very bad start, since Charles actually made a meal of a few hibernating ants, until it occurred to him that this ant army could chase away the wolves who were planning to make a meal of him and Jack. Again, a bit of luck. The ants wondered why some of their army unit, such as Old Three Legs and General Formicularis, had gone missing, but they never suspected the awful truth. Freddy the detective brings in more bugs, including a family of wasps that come to Freddy's rescue repeatedly throughout the rest of the Freddy series, although it's a wasp named George rather than Jacob who saves the day in Freddy the Detective. Jacob is introduced in The Clockwork Twin, when Freddy needs a fast flyer to wing his way to Centerboro to warn the boy Adoniram that his phony aunt and uncle will be coming to get him. In Wiggins for President, also known as Freddy the Politician, we meet the wasps again, and Jacob takes another bow. I'll spend a bit of time on Jacob because he recurs so frequently through the rest of the series, and Jacob's personality is, I think, worth a bit of commentary. When Brooks invented a character that he particularly liked, he often cloned that character. So it was with Jacob. And what other character does he resemble? Let's start with Brooks' characterization. Quote, wasps, as a rule, keep to themselves and have little to do socially with their neighbors. But there was one wasp named Jacob who had struck up quite a friendship with Jinx. The cat had been treed by a dog, and Jacob had come along and stung the dog on the nose and driven him away. He had done it more as a joke than anything else. Wasps have a queer sense of humor. But Jinx had been grateful, and they had had several long talks together. They had found that they both liked to play the same kind of jokes on people, and they could often be seen in a corner of the barnyard snickering over some new mischief they were cooking up. One such prank was played on Freddy, as Jacob decided that he would imitate a grasshopper that Freddy was chasing as part of his diet plan to drop some pounds from his piggy posterior. Of course, Freddy discovers that there is no grasshopper, just Jacob fooling around, and he scolds his friends for making fun of him. Soon there's quite a conversation going on among the three friends, and Jacob assures Freddy that being fat is just part of being a pig. Quote, you're a pretty important pig, and you've done it without making anybody mad at you. Why, you've even been fair to us wasps, and most people don't like us much. Get out the fly swatter, that's what they say when they see one of us. I'd rather be fat and have people smile when they see me than be romantic-looking and have them try to squash me, unquote. Oddly, Freddy had described Jacob as romantic-looking. I don't know, I've never met Jacob, maybe he was. Jacob then goes on to explain that the woodpecker Grover would be a bad president of the First Animal Republic because birds are too careless, and his example is that a bird might try to catch a wasp without thinking of the consequence, namely being stung. Like Jinx, Jacob is gifted with shrewdly skeptical common sense, and while not inclined to take an interest in politics, Jacob comes to the rescue of the First Animal Republic several times during the campaign that finally rid the bean farm of Simon the Rat and Grover the Woodpecker. Jacob and some of his cousins also rescue Freddy from Herb Garble and Mrs. Underdunk in Freddy and the Bean Home News, when our pig is nearly shipped off to Montana to become somebody's pork chops and bacon. Jacob compares his favorite sport, namely stinging villains in the exact tenderest spot on the back of their neck, to an art form, just like Freddy's poetry. Quote, you do a good, careful job, explains Jacob, and then folks remember it. A poem by Freddy, a sting by Jacob, well, it makes an impression. Unlike the wasps, flies don't get no respect from Brooks. Not only is the only insect villain in the series a horsefly, but other flies are often pests, although Brooks does attach a somewhat endearing sense of humor to some of them. Consider this example from Freddy's cousin Wheatley. Mr. Webb the spider had a cold, and when he sneezed, achoo, the flies laughed at him. Quote, they sat in rows on the wall, and they waited for him to sneeze, and they laughed their heads off. They even invited their friends to come hear the sneezing spider, unquote. Somewhat bizarrely, however, Mr. Webb makes friends with a mosquito named Jasper. Jasper is pining for the old days when Mr. and Mrs. Bean, quote, never minded a mosquito bite or two, as long as we didn't overdo it, of course, unquote. Jasper finds Aunt Effie and Uncle Snedeker, who are now occupying the Bean farm, but do not share the Bean's willingness to provide a meal to a hungry mosquito. Note, by the way, that male mosquitoes don't sting, and after his accuracy in Florida regarding the female ant workers, Brooks did revert to featuring an almost exclusively male cast of insect characters, so scientific accuracy in the Freddy series was somewhat doomed. Thankfully, Brooks went back to the facts for the next mosquito. Sybil, in Freddy and the Flying Saucer Plans, was female. Freddy's cousin Wheatley is crawling with caterpillars, and their attack on the Bean's vegetable garden overwhelms those brave spiders, the Webbs. So Freddy forms an unexpected alliance with the Snedekers to chase out the caterpillars. Not an easy task. The Snedekers are locked in a near war with the animals because Aunt Effie is determined to abscond with Mrs. Bean's special teapot while the Beans are abroad in gay Paris. Another recurring insect character is introduced in Freddy and the Enormous. Randolph, the beetle who couldn't walk without tripping over his own legs. His mother, one of the only female insects mentioned by Brooks, is even more of a klutz. As Randolph explains to Freddy, you must excuse me falling down so much, but it's kind of a family failing. All the family. Got too much of everything. Too many legs, too many wings. Look at me now. Got 4 wings. But can I fly? No, sir. Come down like a kite with its tail off as soon as I try. And the same with walking. Got 6 legs. And what can I do with them? If I had 4, same as you, I could manage. As it is, there's always 4 that's walking and 2 that's tripping the others up. Freddy helps him become steady on his feet, and friendship blossoms. Randolph shares the first bit of information on exactly how the Enormous is terrorizing both farm and woodland animals, leading them to steal from the Bean's garden. Meanwhile, Mr. Webb has won the friendship of numerous insects by spinning his bug swing, after the bugs saw how much fun the barnyard animals were having with their big swing down by the pond. The bug swing was in the barn, and it was not such a hit with Mrs. Wogus the cow. It's been practically raining bugs in here for the last 2 days, she said. Can't you get him to move that thing somewhere else? I've got nothing against bugs, but I must say it isn't very pleasant to have a continual procession of them walking down your backbone. True enough. But it's still an utterly charming vision, isn't it? Bugs having fun on a spider-built bug swing. Freddy and the Enormous features quite a bit of bug bravery. Geoffrey the Centipede and his friends unload buckshot from Mr. Bean's rifle, saving the hides of the farm animals as they launch their heroic assault on the old Grimby house in the big woods, where Simon and his family and one of the Bean's old sheets turn out to be the feared Enormous. So when the animals gather in the Bean's living room to celebrate their victory over the rats, Freddy asks Mrs. Bean to include both Geoffrey the Centipede and Randolph the Beetle. Mrs. Bean isn't so sure, but Freddy points out that they would especially enjoy seeing the inside of the house with the new wallpaper and all. So, I guess Martha Stewart might have a new audience for decorating tips. Beetles and centipedes. Who knew? We meet Freddy's smallest friend, Jerry Peters the ant, in Freddy and the Bean Home News. Why Jerry is given a surname, who knows? Maybe to distinguish him from Jerry the rhinoceros? Though you would think the massive difference in size would be enough, so you wouldn't confuse the two. While not a frequent character in the series, Jerry Peters is quite the charming addition to Freddy's social circle. He is introduced as the odd ant out, so to speak. Quote, there was an ant named Jerry Peters who lived in a big anthill near the henhouse. Ants are worthy citizens, but they are not, as a rule, very much fun. They work hard from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, without even stopping for lunch, and they despise all creatures who do not work as hard as they do. Since there are no animals or insects that work as hard as they do, they despise nearly everybody. And as for games and jokes, I don't suppose there is a man living who has ever seen an ant laugh. But this Jerry Peters was different. On warm, sunny days, you would often find him lolling comfortably under the shade of a dandelion leaf, leaning back with his feelers clasped behind his head and his 6 legs crossed, and the little brown beetle which he kept as a pet crouched at his feet. The beetle's name was Fido, and he was devoted to his master. He was not much bigger than the head of a pin, but his heart belonged to Jerry. Exploring the pig pen and curious about all the papers and books, Jerry tries to make Freddy's acquaintance, which was only possible when Freddy constructed a makeshift megaphone. Now stop and think about their first conversation. Who does Jerry remind you of? Here's what Jerry tells Freddy. I want to learn to read. Freddy's response is, what on earth for? Jerry does not mince words. So I can read, stupid. What else would I want to learn for? Again, just like Jinx, Jerry Peters speaks his mind to our pig. But it's not all rudeness and brash repartee. In fact, the ant also has a softer side. Jerry shares a dreamy nature with Freddy. I like things that aren't any use to me, such as watching the clouds on a summer day, or taking walks to nowhere in particular, or listening to the wind in the grass. And as far as I can see, reading is just another of those things. Freddy responds with some high-flown language about reading being the gateway to knowledge, opening up the portals of wisdom, permitting readers to share the thoughts of all great thinkers of the past. Well, Jerry doesn't miss a beat. Such as what? He asks. Clearly stumped, Freddy replies, eh? Jerry persists. Give me just one great thought you've got out of all your reading. Our pig tries to reply with some more high-flown language, but Jerry is having none of it. Freddy is flummoxed by Jerry's persistence. See, here, you, whatever your name is, I am not going to be cross-examined by an ant. They finally reach an agreement, and Jerry learned to read. Quote, by the end of the summer, he could read almost anything. Freddy would open a book, and Jerry would walk across the line of print. When he came to a word he didn't understand, Freddy would tell him what it meant, and Jerry would go on. Often Freddy would leave a book or a magazine open on the desk when he was going out, and Jerry would read along until he got to a word that he didn't know. And then he would just lie down on it and go to sleep until Freddy came back. Or he would try to teach Fido to read. That didn't work very well. So Freddy and Jerry became close friends, and both Jerry and Fido wound up spending the winter in the pig pen, dining on the assortment of crumbs that Freddy was always dropping on the floor. It seems to me that Brooks used the example of Jerry Peters, and he wasn't the only example, to show that we don't need to conform to what others do, or meet their expectations. Even an ant could be a nonconformist. Not to mention, an ant could really get in your face, even if you're his close friend, and echo some of the irreverence that we see in Jinx and Jacob. My favorite example is when Freddy keeps composing poems, in which somehow he, Freddy, became the main event. Jerry asks, don't you ever write about anything but yourself? Freddy replies that he's not sure why this happens. And again, Jerry doesn't miss a beat. Well, I know. It's because you're stuck on yourself. Isn't that what friends are for? Telling us the unvarnished truth about ourselves. And at the end of Freddy and the Bean Home News, Jerry's bluntness saves Freddy from being taken advantage of by Senator Blunder, a friend of the odious Mrs. Underdunk. Jerry tells Freddy in no uncertain terms that Senator Blunder's interest in him was entirely selfish, based on the politician's hope to use the Bean Home newsletter to promote his career. Of course, this being Walter, there's quite the comic ending, because Jerry is too small for anyone else to notice him. Yet Freddy is replying out loud to all of Jerry's blunt and unwelcome advice. Freddy is actually quite flattered by the senator's sweet words, while Jerry isn't taken in at all, and is becoming ever blunter in his comments to our pig. Finally, Freddy crossly tried to get Jerry to quit giving him this unsolicited advice, and so said, "I'm not as easy to make a fool of as all that. I wish you'd shut up and keep your long nose out of my affairs." Of course, Senator Blunder thought these words were directed at him, and so ended the job offer for Freddy to join the senator's staff, which was probably just as well for both Freddy and Jerry. Now, in Freddy and Mr. Camphor, Brooks really piled on the bugs. Remember, this is one of Walter's World War II books, and since no human males were available for hire, Freddy the Pig has lucked into a dream job as caretaker of the rich Mr. Camphor's estate, although trouble is brewing with the return of Mr. Winch and the dirty-faced boy, whose mother is Mr. Camphor's cook. Back on the Bean farm, patriotic fervor for Victory Gardens brings out the bugs and an end to the only bug villain in the series, Zero the horsefly. Mr. Webb had called for a patriotic mass meeting for all bugs, beetles, and caterpillars, advertising entertainment, including exceptional fireworks by the fireflies, not to mention a dance with some pretty strange bug-generated music, maybe featuring the real jitterbug. Walter does not say. The beetle Randolph is the MC at this dance, and he also dances with his mother at this bug jamboree. Mr. and Mrs. Webb decide to arrive by personal aircraft. A huge Luna moth flew them to the barn. Mr. Webb implores all the insects to sacrifice their favorite garden vegetables for the duration of the war. Says our patriotic spider, "Mr. Bean is rationed in what he eats, and if you are patriotic bugs, you won't object to being rationed too." Soon, however, Webb is interrupted by a small potato bug. Quote, "What do you want us to do? Starve? You're a spider. You don't like vegetables anyway." So Webb suggests some wild plants they could eat. The bugs are satisfied and, quote, "suddenly burst into wild and frantic cheering," unquote, much to Freddy's surprise, since he'd never thought of bugs as especially patriotic. Then Zero, the horsefly, started his own campaign to convince the bugs that they were being unfairly asked to sacrifice. "You bugs are a dumb lot to let a pair of spiders tell you what you can and can't do. Is this a free country, or is it going to be run by a couple of small-time spiders? Telling you to be patriotic. Patriotic your grandmother. Go on, eat what you've always eaten. You bet if old Webb liked potatoes, he wouldn't be handing out any such talk. The old killjoy." Some of the insects were inclined to agree. But how to deal with the unpatriotic horsefly? Zero was not easy to catch and put in prison. When Jacob tried to corner him, it turned out that Zero had gone to a special school to learn how to weave spider webs, so he was impossible to catch. So, Zero has become a real threat to the Victory Garden campaign. He even tries to mount a political campaign to quash it. A debate is proposed on the merits of Victory Gardens. Zero is obviously speaking against Victory Gardens. And surprisingly, the speaker who rallies the bugs to sacrifice any meals they might normally take from Mr. Bean's vegetable garden is Charles the Rooster. Even more surprisingly, Charles produces a persuasive speech and holds his temper against the now quite vindictive horsefly. Zero had actually made 3 earlier cameo appearances in the Freddy series. First in Freddy the Detective, then the Clockwork Twin, and also Freddy and the Perilous Adventure, when he tickles Freddy's nose exactly as our pig has disguised himself as a scarecrow. Why is Freddy disguised as a scarecrow? Because Freddy is trying to hide from two state troopers who are tracking him down for absconding with Mr. Golter's hot air balloon. Zero's antics failed, thankfully, and Freddy was not arrested. But in these earlier books, Zero had just engaged in some mischief, while in Freddy and Mr. Camphor, Zero becomes a true villain. As some listeners may know, Zero is actually the only named character in the Freddy series to die. He is dispatched from the Bean Farm and planet Earth by two toads, Waldo and Elmo, who are visiting the farm from Mr. Camphor's estate. Speaking of Mr. Camphor again, Brooks had one more set of insects up his sleeves in this bug-infested book. Fleas. Mr. Bean's neighbor, Old Schermerhorn, has a dog named Johnny, who is so covered with fleas that he's made friends with them and trained them in many tricks. Freddy immediately hires these tiny acrobats to help rid Simon and his family of rats who have taken up residence in Mr. Camphor's attic. They've been destroying much of the furniture and artwork that's stored there. Like the wasps, the fleas love doing what fleas are best at, biting like mad. And the rats flee from the fleas and from Mr. Camphor's estate. While Freddy and Mr. Camphor is the buggiest of the Freddy titles, some of Freddy's pint-sized friends keep helping our pig in later titles. In Freddy and the Popinjay, the wasps attempt to scare off Mac the Wildcat, but in a very comical scene, they instead manage to send him into the thinking hole that Mr. Bean is relaxing in. Thankfully, Mr. Bean is puffing on his pipe, and the smoke knocks out our wildcat friend. Jacob and his family are also key to solving Freddy's predicament with Senor Zingo in Freddy the Magician, while caterpillars and beetles help rid Ollie Groper's restaurant and caravansary of Zingo, who is a vindictive freeloader as well as a cheat, one of the worst villains in the series. In Freddy Goes Camping, not only does Jacob help out again, but crickets, fireflies, grasshoppers, centipedes, and beetles all pitch in to attack the villainous Mr. Eha and Simon the Rat to help Mrs. Fillmore, whose hotel Mr. Eha is trying to take over. It is worth noting that the crickets, who contributed their melodious chirping in an effort to keep Mr. Eha awake, work under union rules authorized for musicians. And so the series rolls on, with more appearances, especially by the Wasps, but also cameos by Petey the Centipede in Freddy the Pilot, Flies in Freddy and the Spaceship, and Horace the Bumblebee in both Freddy and the Flying Saucer Plans and Freddy and the Dragon. However, after World War II, Brooks set his plots more in Centerboro, among other human beings, so we are no longer treated to the charming buggy verse of Freddy in a more rural setting. There is, however, one more endearing example of patriotic bugs. That's in Freddy and the Flying Saucer Plans. A dastardly crew of foreign spies are trying to steal the plans, and Freddy enlists a patriotic mosquito named Sybil to help thwart them, with Sybil explaining that the blood of governors flows through her veins, since she regularly feasts on the New York State governor in her hometown of Albany. In fact, at first the mosquito declines to bite the Russian spy, fearing that it might turn her into a communist. Indeed, the dangerous assignment almost cost Sybil her life when the spy sneezes, achoo, and knocks her under a pillow, gravely injured. Freddy enlists the sheriff's help to find her. Quote, "She took a really big risk, you know. If you or I had done that, they'd have given us the Congressional Medal," unquote. There's also an extended encore for Jerry Peters the Ant and his pet beetle, Fido, in Freddy and the Flying Saucer Plans. Frankly, most of the encore is cribbed from Jerry's original appearance in Freddy and the Bean Home News, but Freddy and Jerry wax philosophical during a discussion of how hard Jerry's ant relatives work and why it makes no sense. Freddy asked, "Well, what's all that work for? They don't have to work like that just to keep their anthills in repair. Don't they ever give parties or sit around and tell stories and sing? or just wander around and look at the scenery. Obviously, ants do none of these things, and so Jerry has nothing in common with other ants. Jerry then observes, "But the ants aren't so much different from the folks in Centerboro that you told me about. Lots of them work harder than they have to, just so they can have as shiny a car or as nice clothes as the people next door. Keeping up with the Joneses. Isn't that what you call it?" Freddie replies, "That's right. It's just showing off. Well, I'd rather have more fun than the people next door. I don't want to keep up with anybody. I'd rather take more naps than the Joneses. Speaking of which, let's go home and take one right now." A fitting conclusion into this inquiry into insects in the Freddyverse, isn't it? Now, before I share a few of my own thoughts about bugs that Brooks brought to life in the 25 Freddy Adventures, note that there are two great little poems in the collected poems of Freddy the Pig. One is dedicated to ants and the other to bees. Here's the one about ants, which I believe was written as part of Freddy's ABCs for animals learning to read. Here it goes. Ants, although admirable, are awfully aggravating. The busy ant works hard all day and never stops to rest or play. He carries things 10 times his size and never grumbles, whines, or cries. And even climbing flower stalks, he always runs. He never walks. He loves his work. He never tires and never puffs, pants, or perspires. And yet, though I praise his boundless vim, I am not really fond of him. That sounds like Freddy for sure, and Jerry Peters would have agreed. Turning to the larger question of why bugs had such a significant role in the Freddy series, my theory is that Brooks, who grew up at a time when children played outside and met up with all sorts of farm animals and other creatures while doing so, felt perfectly at home among them, whether they were tiny spiders like the Webbs or oversized draft horses like Hank. I make no comment on the circus animals or whether Brooks would have been able to relax in the company of rhinos and boa constrictors or lions at Boomschmidt Circus, but he did seem to have a high level of comfort around the animals and insects that would have been common on the farms close to Rome, New York, which was his very own Centerboro, where he grew up. And in the same way that the animals were brought to life with distinct personalities, he gave distinct personalities to many of the insects. Sometimes the personalities reflect human opinions of the insects. For example, flies are pests. But sometimes the insect is an outlier, such as Jerry the ant. In fact, Jinx's rather rascally personality was cloned with Jacob the wasp, while Freddy's dreamy, poetic persona was at least partially cloned with Jerry the ant. For children, the presence of small critters like spiders and ants and wasps and beetles might send a subliminal message that no matter your size, you can have a positive impact on your world, as the patriotic bugs did in Freddy and Mr. Camphor and Freddy and the Flying Saucer Plants. So what does this tell us today? Although I know Walter Brooks was a man of his time and likely would never have entertained this thought, I have been struck by how much Brooks's characterization of bugs rings true today. Like humans and all other animals, bugs have personalities and friendships and their own points of view. For example, scientists have discovered that the lowly cockroach has quite a sense of humor and enjoys a good laugh as much as any human would. And some scientists are studying insects for and discovering a wide range of traits such as sociability, boldness, and aggressiveness. Certainly, we have seen all of these traits in Freddy's Buggyverse, haven't we? So, let's smile at the next ant, spider, beetle, or wasp that we see, remembering Jerry Peters, the Webbs, Randolph and his mom, and Jacob's extended family of wasps. Now, it's time for me to bug off. Thank you for listening. Bye.